everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us virtually for our latest lecture feature brought to you by the Preservation Society of Newport County. My name is Leslie Jones, and I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator, and we're thrilled to learn from Dr. Judith Major this evening on the fascinating subject of Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer and Newport. As many of you have learned, there's a wonderful intersection in tonight's lecture with our friends at the Newport Art Museum, who care for and are located in the Griswold house, formerly the resident of Mariana's uncle, J.N.A. Griswold. Before we get to Dr. Major's presentation, just have a few announcements to share with you all to keep you updated on what's happening with the Preservation Society. First, we'd like to ask you to join us again next Thursday for another lecture by one of our 2019-2020 research fellows, Sebastian Dutton, who will be presenting on his research into the surprisingly fascinating subject of decorative hardware at the Breakers and Marble House, as well as the Elms. More information is on our website, and you can also register like you did for this lecture by emailing program rsvp@newportmansions.org. We just ask that you remember to include that you're RSVPing for Sebastian Dutton's lecture in the subject line. We're also pleased to announce the dates of several of our July lectures coming up, so mark your calendars. On Thursday, July 2nd, we'll feature the Jacqueline and William P. Egan II lecture. This will be our 2019-2020 fellow, Mathilde Tollet, who will be presenting on her findings regarding architect Richard Morris Hunt's use of decorative wrought iron at a variety of his properties, including Marble House and the Breakers. On Thursday, July 9th, the annual Pamela and David B. Ford lecture will take place, featuring Dr. Susan Scholwer, who is the Executive Director of Historic Preservation and Collections at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Her presentation will be titled The Women Who Saved Mount Vernon. More information will be on our website soon for that one as well. Thursday, July 16th, Catherine Gilliland of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library will be presenting The People's House, Jacqueline Kennedy's White House Restoration Project, which will also be offered by Zoom, and information again will be forthcoming on our website. And finally, on July 28th, which is a Tuesday, different from our regular Thursday night programs, Sebastian Dutton will again be presenting the findings of his year-long fellowship research project into the digitization of historic sites, which if any of you have participated or used our virtual visits, Sebastian is the genius behind recording all of our historic interiors and bringing them to the public. And that is the 2020 Ido and Peter Kiernan lecture. So as you can tell, we have a lot coming up. We're excited to have you join us, but don't forget you can start experiencing the Newport Mansions as soon as tomorrow in person, as we've recently reopened the Breakers and the Elms for visitors. So please remember to visit our website where you can buy tickets in advance. We are strictly following the state of Rhode Island's requirements as part of the phase 2 reopening. So reserving your tickets in advance for timed entry online is your best bet to be able to come and experience the Newport Mansions. So now on to our lecture this evening. As you'll note, everyone here has been muted, and you'll remain muted for the duration of the program. We encourage you to submit your questions along the way using the chat feature on Zoom. And you can direct those questions to me, Leslie Jones. When we've concluded the presentation, I will take those questions and ask them to Dr. Major. I will ask as many as I possibly can, and she'll respond accordingly. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Major join us tonight from her home in Kansas. She is a renowned landscape historian who has concentrated on 19th century American landscape architecture. Her books include, hopefully you can see it, here we go. Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, The Evolution of a Landscape Critic in the Gilded Age. This book that I'm holding in my hands right now is available on our website at newportstyle.com, as well as at our Bannister's Wharf Museum shop, which is located here in Newport. So please stop by or visit our website to order the book. Dr. Major's other book is titled To Live in the New World, A.J. Downing and American Landscape Gardening. And Dr. Major lectures frequently on both of these subjects. She has also contributed a chapter entitled Toward an American Gardening Theory to the New York Botanical Gardens Flora Illustrata, which won the 2015 American Horticultural Society Book Award. She is the recipient of numerous grants and honors, including the Mellon Residential Fellowship, a Graham Foundation grant, and the Samuel H. Kress Publication Fellowship. She is a charter member of the Landscape History chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, and she chairs sessions and gives presentations at national and international conferences. She's taught at the University of Kansas for 23 years, in the architecture program, and ended her academic career at Kansas State University in the Department of Landscape Architecture, retiring as Professor Emerita in 2014. So without further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Judith Major.
So I'm on?
You are on.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start. The title of my paper is The News of Newport. Mrs. Schuyler Van Rensselaer is expected for the season. And I'm just going to start. On July 6th, 1900, the News of Newport, in a special to the New York Times Society, announced that Mrs. Schuyler Van Rensselaer is expected tomorrow at the White Cottage on Red Cross Avenue for the season. This was the third summer that Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, as she was also known, spent at this fashionable resort for the wealthy. She returned periodically and rented a different residence, Hone Cottage, just blocks from her uncle, John N.A. Griswold's house on Bellevue Avenue, now, of course, the Newport Art Museum. In 1900, at the age of 49, Van Rensselaer was one of the most respected art, architecture, and landscape critics in the country. Thanks to the resources of her wealthy mercantile family, her grandfather and father were in the China trade. She was given a sophisticated European education, and almost unheard of for a woman of her time. Van Rensselaer was one of the new breed of critics, and she closely examined the nature of her profession and brought a disciplined scholarship to the craft. She considered herself a professional and led the effort of women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to claim the titles of artist, architect, historian, and journalist. Much like her contemporary Edith Wharton, Van Rensselaer's cosmopolitan education and elevated social status gave her access to the homes and gardens of her classes. This allowed her to mingle with authors, artists, and affluent patrons of the arts, and enabled her to write with familiarity about these topics. Let's see if this works. Okay. Van Rensselaer's close relationship with the designer of Central Park, Frederick Olmsted, influenced her ideas in landscape gardening. She preferred this term over landscape architecture, and her interest in botany and geology shaped the ideas that her critiques of art, architecture, and landscape were based on. She was familiar with the works of Charles Darwin, and she frequently referred to him. She wrote about the flora and geology in many places, including Nantucket and Newport. This is the best slide I could find. In her art criticism, she was scathing when a painter did not demonstrate even a proficient level of knowledge of the natural world. When she reviewed an exhibit of flower and fruit paintings at the Academy of Design, she remarked, "As for Mr. John F. Weir's large picture of peonies, it quite deserves that an action for libel be brought against it." Mariana Griswold was 13 in 1864 when she first visited Newport to stay at her uncle's newly completed house with her parents and 3 brothers and sisters. One can imagine the children playing at Bailey's Beach under the watchful eyes of their governess and nanny. The adults would be attending the season's many afternoon and evening receptions. An American author who lived in Newport in 1864 recalled the constant procession of foreign visitors and described the many entertainments he attended. In between these events, it was the fashion to parade up and down Bellevue Avenue in elegant carriages, past summer cottages such as Chateau sur the Gothic revival King's Coat. The grander cottages, including the Breakers and Marble House, were not built until the 1890s. King's Coat had recently been vacated by the wealthy Southern planter George Noble Jones, who left at the start of the Civil War. Nearby was a reminder that the Civil War still raged. Newport's Atlantic House Hotel, seen here, was the temporary quarters of the U.S. Naval Academy that had moved from Annapolis because Southern sympathies ran so high in Maryland. That summer in Cold Harbor, Virginia, the Union suffered 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes during an offensive against fortified rebels. Almost 30 years later, Van Rensselaer recalled both the glory and gloom of the war. On Fifth Avenue, she saw fresh recruits going to war and returning pathetically worn. Mariana's family spent their next 3 summers either in Newport with their Uncle John or with other Griswold relatives in Connecticut. I can find no information about those years. In 1868, the family moved to Dresden, the beautiful capital of the Electorate and Kingdom of Saxony. Mariana took full advantage not only of Dresden's, but other continental cities' rich cultural offerings, becoming fluent in French and German, and fluent in the requisite languages of art, architecture, and landscape criticism. These years figured large in her future profession. Her taste in the highest forms of art was fashioned early in the opera houses, museums, and parks of Europe, and she frequently returned to these familiar cities to write about music, painting, sculpture, architecture, and landscape gardening. Van Rensselaer's writing career began early in 1876, 3 years after her marriage to Schuyler Van Rensselaer in Dresden, and 1 year after the birth of their only son, George. They nicknamed him Gree or Gigi, mostly Gree. The family lived on their return from Europe in New Brunswick, New Jersey. In every generation of Griswolds, there was a son named George. And although I tried my best to keep them straight in my book, I failed. Let me go back one. Oh, there it is. Let me take it here to express my immense gratitude to Mariana Van Rensselaer Griswold, the great niece of my Mariana, who emailed me last year thanking me for bringing Mariana the recognition she so deserved. Mimi, as she calls herself, straightened me out about the Georges. Her great-grandfather was George V, who was Mariana's brother. Her father was George VII. Let me quote from Mimi's email. My father named me after his favorite great aunt. He loved his Aunt May. She was warm, kind, brilliant, and fascinating. Mimi continues, I have inherited many personal items from Mariana, including the only other copy of the bronze portrait of her by Augustus Saint-Gaudens. The other portrait, as most of you know, is in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She continues, I also have some of her personal correspondence to my grandfather. Mimi sent me family photographs just last week. A scholar's dream come true. Too late for my book, but not for this talk. Let me offer a brief discussion of Van Rensselaer's rise to prominence as a critic. As I said, her writing career began in 1876. Van Rensselaer was not satisfied with the typical life of the upper class, and she found social calls an intolerable burden because of the hours they entailed. hours that she could spend writing. You'll see this predilection expressed over and over again in her life. One of her first assignments was as a regular correspondent for the American Architect and Building News. This was an impressive achievement, as women writers on architecture did not generally publish in professional journals, such as American Architect, which had an almost exclusively male readership. Her articles appeared in the most prestigious periodicals of the day, including the American Art Review, Scribner's, Harper's, Century, The Atlantic, and the North American Review. And she had a 10-year affiliation with Garden Forest, which is the main subject of my book. Van Rensselaer once told Sylvester Kohler, her editor at the American Art Review, that he ought to know that Americans considered women incapable of starting a business scheme of any kind. Yet her closest female friends were among the best professionals in their chosen fields. Harriet Hubbard Eyre, or Eyre, I'm not sure how to pronounce, was a Chicago socialite who became a beauty product entrepreneur. She was the first woman to build a successful cosmetics empire, founding the Recamier Manufacturing Company in New York. Dora Wheeler studied under William Merritt Chase and was one of the best-known commercial artists of the day. Candace, her mother, Mrs. Candace Wheeler, was a textile specialist who formed her own firm, Associated Artists, a wholly female enterprise. Cecilia Beaux was acknowledged as one of the leading portraitists of her time. Ida Tarbell was a muckraking journalist who took on such giants as the Standard Oil Company, and Theodate Pope was an architect, almost unheard of among her female contemporaries. Her closest friend was Helena Decay Gilder. Although Helena began her career as a painter, she increasingly dedicated her talent to advocating for art, artists, and women, and was a founder of the Art Students League and the Society of American Artists. Her husband, Richard Watson Gilder, was a poet and editor of Scribner's and Century magazines, and Van Rensselaer's editor and friend. I'm going to spend a minute discussing Van Rensselaer's life between the years of 1884 to 1885. Her husband, Schuyler, I've never found a photograph of him, was a mining engineer who died in March 1884 from capillary bronchitis, a lung disease caused by coal dust. She was a widow for her remaining 50 years. The following month, her father died in Dresden, and soon after this double tragedy, she sailed to Europe with her 9-year-old son. Van Rensselaer returned to New York in October 1885 with her mother, son, and her younger sister, Lydia. As if the family had not gone through their share of sorrow, Lydia's husband, Konstantin von Zembowski, committed suicide in May 1885. Enough of death. Let's move on to a cheerier subject. New things are popping up on the internet every year, and I check periodically to see if there is anything of interest on A.J. Downing, the topic of my first book, or Van Rensselaer. Several years ago, again too late for my book, I discovered a cache of letters from Van Rensselaer to Helena Decay Gilder in the Lilly Library at the Indiana University in Bloomington, period from 1889 to 1915. I had to learn all over again how to read Van Rensselaer's handwriting. She wrote very poorly. Luckily, she was an early user of the typewriter, and a good number of the letters were typed. I was surprised at the intimacy of the letters. Apparently, Helena was her dearest friend. Mariana signed off as Renssy, and I found no other correspondence in which this was the case. I'm going to use Mariana's first name for the remainder of my talk. As Van Rensselaer herself complained, her lawful name was too ponderous. The letters are full of personal details, gossip about people mostly unknown to me, and political opinions. I'm not sure why I was invited to a symposium celebrating the 100th anniversary of because Van Rensselaer did not support women's suffrage. Neither did Helena nor Ida Tarbell. The letters display her love of dogs, and I had to get this in because I love dogs too. At one point she wrote, "I miss my dog Kaiser very much, but I have got a new dog on trial who weighs 140 pounds and seems amiable in proportion. His looks will scare evildoers, but he is merely a canine protector. Kaiser was a real human friend." There were many flashes of humor as well in the letters. This one woman, whose portraits display a rather grim visage. For this lecture, I will take the more personal material, such as her love of Newport and her lack of socializing, from the 12 letters that Mariana wrote to Helena. She also wrote a number of letters from Newport to her friend, the architect Theodate Pope, who, by the way, was an ardent supporter of women's suffrage. You'll have to read my book to find out what is in these letters, because I can't cover them in my talk. I will also incorporate her 1886 essay for Century magazine entitled American Country Dwelling, in which she criticized Newport's domestic architecture. For her landscape criticism, I will use Olmsted's design of the grounds for Rough Point, the estate of Frederick W. Vanderbilt, that gave her the opportunity to write about the appropriate treatment of the site in landscape architecture. This article was published in Garden and Forest in 1888. Let me take a drink of water. Mariana had a 20-year history with Newport when she wrote about the town's domestic architecture for Century in 1886. She encouraged architects to build appropriately with regard to the nature of a given site. A country home admirable in Newport, she wrote, could not be repeated in Mount Desert, Maine, or in the Catskills. Mariana explored Bellevue Avenue and the adjacent roads that led to the Atlantic Ocean and found a succession of summer homes with many kinds of architectural types, some well screened by trees and isolated in extensive grounds, others on treeless sites and close together. She observed that no place revealed as clearly as Newport the extreme directions that American architecture had taken. The Isaac Bell House is an example of the shingle style, as you can see. The house, which has a stick-style architectural elements and false half timbering. Mariana asked what sort of structure would be both appropriate and beautiful for the cramped and treeless site far out on Bellevue Avenue and along the border of Newport's cliffs, where nature supplied a line of broken cliffs with such an agreeable form and color. She cautioned that this sort of beauty was quiet and subtle and could be easily marred by the touch of man. On the cliffs, any structure that was not entirely harmonious was strikingly discordant. The best among the recent Newport houses, in Mariana's opinion, did not have an exacting site. McKim, Mead, and White's design for the landscape painter and etcher Samuel Coleman was singled out for being, and I quote, happy in expression, dignified yet rural, simple yet refined. Mariana took minor exception to the detailing of the piazza. She preferred this term over porch, but she felt that the rather commonplace situation of the house was given individuality by a terrace that united the house with the lawn. For those of you who are not architects, the New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White was the largest architectural office in the United States. The firm later joined the team of artists, including Olmsted, who gathered in Chicago to design the 1893 Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition. 2 years later, in 1888, in an article in Newport, published in Garden and Forest, Mariana offered a site design by Olmsted as an appropriate response to the beauty of Newport's rugged cliffs. In a letter to Mariana, Olmsted complained about the problems he was facing with his clients, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick W. Vanderbilt at Rough Point, who was trying to prevent the installation of a decorated lawn of smooth blue turf between the sea-facing meadows and the rocky edge of the estate. The Vanderbilts were being swayed by their friends and neighbors who thought what Olmsted wanted to do was shocking. Olmsted envisioned a rugged moorland character for the seaward side of the house. Grass kept down with sheep. The ground between and above the rocks left half arid, planted with low wild bushes. Could he possibly be wrong? Yes, Mariana. Olmsted thought the turf would be an abuse of the public taste. This early site plan of Rough Point from June 1887 shows the character of its rugged and irregular shoreline. 4 months later, in an article for Garden and Forest, Mariana wrote about Olmsted's design for the Vanderbilt place, describing it as most interesting work now in progress at Newport. I think Mariana meant to convince the recalcitrant Vanderbilts with clever psychological ploy. I am told, Mariana commented, that the owners are considering whether it will not be well to adopt a scheme for treating their grounds, which will be an entire novelty in Newport. The proposed design was as Olmsted described in his letter. The lawn and garden shrubberies were confined to the entrance side of the house, with the most natural treatment possible on the seaward slope. She depicted the rocky portion nearest the cliff walk as interesting and picturesque, and gave her considered and expert opinion that the best device would be planting of low native shrubs, creepers, and wildflowers that would simulate as far as possible a spot which has not been planted at all. Mariana challenged the Vanderbilts, and I quote, "If one loves either the best kind of beauty or the truest kind of appropriateness," end of quote, then Olmsted's new idea should be carried out. She observed that it would be 1,000 pities if the most beautiful spot on the cliff walk was mutilated in the same way as a certain unnamed estate on Ochre Point. I'll move to September 1898 to the first letter Mariana wrote to Helena, at least that I know about. She reported that the climate in Newport suited her. They had a comfortable and pretty house. Mariana's mother often traveled with her after her husband's death, and they lived together in New York. The house had no view of the water, but was surrounded by fine, wide groves of trees. As typical, Mariana led a quiet life, remarking that she had been, and I quote, "quieter than anybody under 90 ever was at Newport." She was 47 at the time. She liked having people about, but didn't want to see them. I think that's hilarious. She lunched out a few times and went to big Vanderbilt party, adding, "just to see what such things are like," exclamation point. The party was probably at Frederick Vanderbilt's Rough Point. Mariana served as president of the Women's Auxiliary of the University Settlement Society, and Mrs. Frederick Vanderbilt was on the committee. She closed the letter, writing that the summer had been so peaceful and homelike, yet so cheerful that I want very much to come again next year. Mariana did visit Newport the next year and the year after, but I have found no letters written to Helena from Newport until July 1912. That summer, Mariana rented Home Cottage. Her mother had died in 1908, which was, and I quote, very comfortable, only too full of things, good, bad, and indifferent. She was fortunate the cottage boasted a big bay window in the dining room where she could put her typewriter. Mariana was always busy writing. She worked on correcting proofs for her books, translations, poems, learning to read Dutch for her history of New York, and many other projects. She loved being in Newport, writing, and I quote, I had forgotten how beautiful it was, although I thought I remembered very well, and I delight so in seeing the ocean and smelling the air. Mariana thought the ocean pure heaven. She once wrote, a splendid sky and the breath of a tearing wind tell us of the splendid sea. Mariana wrote Helena less than a week later and proclaimed Newport's climate perfect for her. The town was very gay, although she did not know it from personal experience, because once again, she was leading the quietest of lives and seeing anyone. She did tell Helena of one exciting outing. She saw the finish of, and I quote, the one good sailing race, which the fog permitted the cup defenders to have. A most beautiful sight from Bateman's Point, with all three yachts coming in side by side, with the sun shining through their big sails. As you know, Newport has a long-standing sailing history. The Newport Yacht Club formed in 1893. In September, Mariana wrote to Helena that she had enjoyed the summer in spite of her lack of strength. She added that even if she felt stronger elsewhere, she would rather be in Newport. She often complained about her health. She had frequent attacks of asthma that at times kept her in bed for weeks. Mariana recommended a product to Helena, another asthma sufferer, that had helped her for years. It was an atomizer with iodine laced with a very little cocaine. When I read this, I was surprised that an educated woman had fallen for such a scam. The so-called medication is described on a recent website called thequackdoctor.com. The product originated in Ohio, where Dr. Nathan Tucker started the asthma-specific company in 1889. Early 20th century analysis found that the drug contained cocaine and atropine. The company emphasized that the amount of cocaine was tiny, but the Journal of the American Medical Association didn't approve, and I quote from the journal. When one considers the prevalence of the cocaine habit and demoralizing and brutalizing effect that this habit has on its victims, the viciousness of the indiscriminate sale of a preparation of this sort becomes evident. The journal's author was particularly concerned about the method of taking the medicine. It was vaporized and inhaled into the nose. I quote again from the journal. It is only necessary to call attention to those known as coke sniffers to realize the enormous harm that can be done by taking of cocaine in this way. Before explaining Mariana's opinion of women's suffrage, I want to mention the references to Edith Wharton that I found in Mariana's letters to Helena. Dr. Richard Guy Wilson will be interested in this because we discussed why we couldn't find any mention of Mariana about Wharton or Wharton about Mariana when their lives and interests intersected in so many ways. Just a bit of information to put the letters in context. In 1885, at the age of 23, Edith Newbold Jones married Edward Teddy Wharton. Early in their marriage, Teddy was found to be suffering from acute depression that later manifested as a more serious disorder. And in 1908, Teddy's mental state was determined to be incurable. Now you'll be able to better understand what I found in two letters from the fall of 1910. Just a minute, I need a water. Mariana wrote, I have a letter just now from Johnson Morton, who is an author friend of hers, who has just got back from Europe, bringing both Mr. and Mrs. Wharton. He says that Mr. W. is in a very nervous, depressed, melancholy state. They do not know yet, until they have seen doctors, what will be arranged for him. Morton says he shall stay with Mrs. Wharton until things are settled. A short time later, Mariana wrote, Johnson Morton thinks Teddy perfectly sane, only melancholy, but he may grow worse any time. They have not decided upon anything. At best, it looks as though there are hard days ahead for poor Mrs. Wharton, in divorce 3 years later. My lecture ends on a perplexing topic, Mariana's argument against women's suffrage. How to explain what certainly seems a contradiction. Mariana's women's suffrage story began in Colorado Springs in 1893, when she took her 18-year-old tubercular son, Bree, to Colorado Springs after deciding that she had to go west to find a dry climate. Bad news over with. The climate failed to cure her son. He died on April 22nd, 1894. For more Mariana's experiences in Colorado Springs and the death of her son, you can read my book. She was finishing an article for Century Magazine and writing to Gilder, her editor and Helena's husband. In November 1893, she told him, and I quote, "In this state, women's suffrage has been established with a proviso that women are not subject to jury or military or sheriff duties, and they call it equal suffrage, exclamation point. They say the miners did it in the hopes that all the unmarried women in New England would come to Colorado. But on the other hand, not a single marriage license has been taken out here since the vote. You know, I don't approve of new rights and duties being laid upon us as long as we fulfill our traditional ones of bringing up children and privately ruling the men. But I shall vote if I am here long enough to show I am conscientious even against my private opinion." Her son Bree had much to do with convincing his mother to vote. Mariana admitted that he had threatened to carry her to the polls if she did not go, and I quote, "as a revenge for the way I have talked good citizenship to him ever since he was born." She voted, and the candidate she supported won, but Mariana was still convinced that women's suffrage was being put through in Colorado in a very silly way. After her son's death, she immediately returned to New York and began her campaign against women's suffrage. In May 1894, Mariana began writing a series entitled Thoughts on Women's Suffrage for the Journal, actually it was a newspaper, World, which was published several months later in pamphlet form that you see here, Should We Ask for the Suffrage? She began establishing her credentials, stating that she was speaking out as a New York woman who had lived in other countries and other parts of the United States. She wanted it known that she was a working woman who for many years had been associated with other working women and with men of various classes and kinds. Mariana reasoned that the natural and admirable tendency of women was to shun an active public life, but she had accepted personal publicity to earn a living and was willing to make the sacrifice for a good cause. In 1896, for example, she drove to Albany 3 times to appear before the city committee in the Senate chamber in support of school reform. Mariana feared women's suffrage would encourage women who lack certain, and I quote, certain elements of character and feeling essential to a finely feminine character. I'm not sure what that means. To seek out the life of an active politician and to devote their lives and energies to public affairs. I wonder what she would think of the 2020 campaign. Okay. For Mariana, the feminine character had a separate sexual sphere than men. Each sex had its own proper and natural place in society, and men and women should perform different and contrasting roles, functions, and tasks. If this is strange to you, think of the women in this country who still believe the same thing. Another argument that she presented was that the establishment of women's suffrage in New York would be a risk during a time of economic and social uncertainty. It's true that the Panic of 1893 was a spectacular financial crisis that contributed to an economic recession. The poor treatment of workers led to the organization of labor unions, and as a result of the panic, stock prices declined, many banks closed, and tens of thousands of businesses failed. I suppose that Mariana thought that men should be able to address these problems without the distraction of marching suffragettes. In 1894, Helena also wrote a pamphlet against women's suffrage. Quote, "I can't tell you how much I admired your pamphlet," Mariana wrote. "It is a true work of literary art and a fine quality, and it made me cry partly because it touched me and partly because it made me so envious." During that year, the two friends exchanged letters with lengthy passages about women's suffrage. In October, Mariana gleefully wrote to Helen, "The way that the Massachusetts women have failed even to register now that they have a chance to vote, whether they want the suffrage or not, is the most cheerful possible fact. The registration is so very small that the vote itself will be a farce. I fancy the suffragists all over the country must be horrified at the apathy of their banner state in the East." The Massachusetts Historical Society notes that Massachusetts abolitionists were some of the first figures who vocally opposed women's exclusion from political life. Demanding the vote and other reforms, they launched the organized women's movement at the first National Women's Rights Convention held in Worcester in 1850. Yet Massachusetts also had the oldest and strongest anti-suffrage organization in the United States, founded the year after Mariana's letter. I had to put this in. This is a gathering at Marble House. Alva Belmont was a believer, and she loved, she really supported women's suffrage. William Morgan, in the introduction to the Dover edition of Van Rensselaer's Henry Hobson Richardson in his work, uses Mariana's position on suffrage to reduce her to a gentlewoman, when in fact, the New York women were about equally divided between the pro and anti-suffrage camps. Does her stance in Eveline, as Morgan claimed, that she was an amateur and neither an outstanding scholar nor a brilliant researcher? Cynthia Kinnard, in her PhD thesis on Mariana, states that she was decidedly not a feminist and asks, and I quote, "How can one be a lady and an art critic at the same time?" She suggests that this contradiction remains to confound appreciation of her to this day. Kinnard takes Mariana to task for having definite ideas about the role of women that colored her writing as an art critic. I only studied her art criticism as it related to a few topics in my book, but I can find no such influence of her ideas about the role of women in her writings on architecture or landscape gardening. Mariana believed that it was a woman's role to influence and to educate, but these aims also define the role of a critic, as was spelled out by a late 19th century English art critic who wrote, and I quote, "It is the business of criticism to teach people how to look." Thus, I propose that the mission of the critic cannot be differentiated by gender. Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer managed to be both a lady and a critic, weaving together the worlds of art, architecture, and landscape architecture. Thank you.
Thank you
That's
so
it.
much, Dr. Major. That was wonderful. Thank you. I want to again encourage everyone to submit their questions through the chat feature. We have some great ones to start off our conversation this evening. Also, I wanted to remind everyone that this has been a recorded program, so you'll be able to rewatch it as a part of our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending that information out hopefully tomorrow. So one of the questions that we have is going back to the beginning of your presentation. When Mariana's family moved to Dresden, what was the reason why they moved to Dresden?
Well, a niece, I found this out in a footnote, and I'm not sure if it's right because Mimi doesn't, his father has died, and she wanted to ask if it was true. Apparently, he was having an affair, and his wife found out about it and moved the family to Dresden. But another thing, that after the Civil War, the shipping business really declined, and of course it was a lot cheaper to live in Europe. So pick either one.
Either one has a very interesting story to tell.
Yes.
With all of her work as a critic, was she ever consulted to provide any designs for landscapes? Or was she just a critic?
No,
and
she was just
pure
a critic.
Okay, great. This is actually one of my questions. You mentioned, as you were describing the landscape design of Rough Point for Mr. Vanderbilt and Cliff Walk, that there was another home on Cliff Walk that she did not approve of the landscape design. Was that the Breakers?
No, that was built a few years after she was writing, and I have no idea what that house was. I should know, but I don't.
Maybe that's something for us to find out ourselves as well. Yes. Okay. And a question for you personally, Dr. Major, as a landscape historian, is there a Newport landscape or any landscape in particular that you find to be the most interesting?
Oh, it would definitely be Rough Point. When I was there for a conference, and I was told to meet the supervisor of the grounds at the gate, and he took me for the most marvelous tour. He spent hours with me, taking me down to where Miss Duke swam, and he showed me around. He talked about the camels that she kept, and it was an amazing tour. So I really have to say Rough Point.
Great. Would Mrs. Van Rensselaer have crossed paths with Isabella Stewart Gardner in Europe or in New England?
Yes, there is a letter, and I'm not sure if she actually met her, but in the what was her name, Gardner, in her archives, there is a letter from Van Rensselaer.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Was her stance on suffrage something that affected her friendships or her social relationships with any of her peers?
I actually don't think so. One of her good friends was, as I said, was Theodore Pope, and she was a rabid suffragette. And she teased her that when adopted a son, that she should have adopted a daughter, that so she could teach her the good, what should I say, the good about women.
Oh, are we frozen? Can you hear me, Dr. Major?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. We have a question from someone who's actually in the midst of reading your book. And one of their observations is that Mariana did not have an affinity for geraniums. Is that the case, or was it perhaps the color selection of geraniums?
Well, she had a battle with the man who was working on the Boston Common Garden. And it was a double insult because he was the one who he was the one that produced that geranium that she found so offensive. It was a terrible color. And she not only insulted his design because she thought it was it was too, what should I say? I can't think of the word, but she talked about the responsibility of florists who were responsible for for teaching people that a taste in the flowers. And she mentioned this parade that she saw that had the worst flower arrangements. And so they battled. He took the train down to her house when she was living in, I think it was Marion, Massachusetts. And he didn't knock on the door, but he said that for somebody who wrote about landscape, he saw all of these weeds in her lawn. And he just hated her. He put her editorial about him in his annual report. And, they just battled back and forth. So, and she did hate geraniums, especially of that color.
And it was a red color, I believe. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, yes.
Did she have a favorite plant or flower for landscaping with at any particular time?
I don't know. She mentioned something in her letters to to Helena, that I can't remember, but I can't remember whether she ever talked about her favorite plants. She loved weeds that blossomed, and she particularly talks about them in Marion. And this guy who designed the Boston Gardens, I think had missed the blooming of the so-called weeds in her garden. And so I can't remember her specifying any particular flower that she was fond of.
As intersecting her criticism of both art and landscape, were there any particular landscape painters that she had an affinity for?
Well, she really hated Turner. She did not like realist paintings. She thought that Perrault was the best because he didn't paint what was there, but what he saw, and he made judgments about that. And so she had very, very particular opinions about painters, and she disliked the writings of Ruskin as well. And he, of course, was a great supporter of Turner.
Interesting. Well, we'll wrap up with one more question. This is it seems like an observation from your PowerPoint presentation. Both Mariana and her mother were quite slim in the 1890 photos that you showed. This was in contrast to many other women of the day who attended Newport parties, from what we have as evidence. Was that a family characteristic, or was Mariana? Is there a part of Mariana's personality that she was strict with her diet as well?
No, there was a funny part of the letter that I was going to include. She said that she had gained 10 pounds and she was up to 127, and she had to go to New York to buy a new wardrobe. But you can see that she really gained weight when she got older.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Major. That was really a wonderful presentation. I encourage everyone to read the book, and you can buy the book once again at newportstyle.com. And you can also, if you're in Newport, you can visit our location at Bannister's Wharf to purchase the book as well. I want to thank you again, Dr. Major, for taking the time to speak to us this evening. And also to all of you who have joined us, thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Everybody take care.
Thank you, everybody.